Okay, this is the review for U.S. History Semester 2, Test 3. In 1960 election, Americans experienced the presidential debates in two ways, on the radio and on TV. Okay, the picture kind of gives you a little clue, as does the word election. Public opinion on the debates varied depending on how they experienced the debate. This was the first time that there was a televised debate, so they could see what the presidential candidates looked like. And a lot of people who watched it on TV thought that John Kennedy was more handsome or better, more healthy looking than Richard Nixon. On the radio, they might have thought that Richard Nixon was the better candidate because they didn't have to look at him, I suppose. Okay, the following were issues brought up in the election. It's defense spending, okay, that's military, and international affairs were big since it was during the Cold War. Also religion, because he was Catholic, Kennedy's religion was an issue. Before President Kennedy, all the presidents were Protestant. Okay, John F. Kennedy won. He was known for some famous speeches. Here are some of his famous lines. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country is the finishing part of that. We cannot fail their trust. We cannot fail to try. We shall pay any price, bear any burden to assure the survival and success of liberty. Okay, in his presidency, his most famous quote was, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And that was at his inaugural address. Kennedy was president during the Cold War with Russia. Some Cold War events he oversaw were, and number one is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you would have read about that in Odyssey. Number two is the Bay of Pigs invasion. And number three, he visited Berlin, Germany to show support against the Soviets. Okay, so the Cuban Missile Crisis. When confronted with Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba, Kennedy responded by, okay, he blockaded the island. So blockading the island is how he responded. Kennedy helped establish the Peace Corps in 1961. That's the year. The Peace Corps' goals were to 1. Train men and women. 2. Improve Americans' understanding of other people's cultures. 3. Help people understand the culture of the American people. All right. In one of his speeches, Kennedy used the phrase "new frontier." This was later used to describe several of his policies. These policies included, number one is space exploration. 2. Advancements in science. 3. The pursuit of peace. Okay, Kennedy and Vietnam. A conflict in the southeastern country of Vietnam, Southeast Asia, okay, it's a Southeast Asian country, drew the attention of the USA. Kennedy sent military advisors to help South Vietnam deal with its communist neighbor North Vietnam. Let me see. Okay, the country of Vietnam had a violent war war-torn past before Americans got involved. So even before we were there, they had a very violent past, violent history. During World War II, Vietnam was controlled by, and the correct fill in the blank is Japan. Following World War II, the French occupied Vietnam. In 1954, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu caused the French to abandon Vietnam. After the French left, USA supported the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Okay, as more and more US soldiers were killed and the war dragged on, the Vietnam War became very unpopular in the United States. Groups like these protested the war. Okay, we've got the Students for a Democratic Society, Student Peace Union, and Vietnam Veterans Against the War. So you notice there's a lot of young people protesting against this. And I want you to think about why that might be. I don't know if we're going to get into it in the next slide. Let's see. Okay, so there was a draft in Vietnam. A draft during the Vietnam War. A draft means you didn't get a choice as to whether or not you enlisted in the military. You were told you enlisted. So you would get a draft card and you would have to go enlist. And if you didn't, you were arrested. So a lot of young people were going to Canada if they didn't want to go in. They were leaving America to go to Canada if they didn't want to fight. And that's why it was becoming more and more unpopular. Okay, even though there were widespread protests against the war, President Richard Nixon claimed that most Americans supported the war. He called these people the silent majority. Okay, so the majority meaning most of the people were silent. Okay, 1968, there was an election, and the Democratic National Convention was in Chicago that year. Okay, but it was most famous for the large protests there. So there were lots of protests going on in Chicago during that convention because the people knew they would get a lot of press. Let's see what else we have. The American Liberty Party ran in the election. They were led by George Wallace and Curtis LeMay. But the main presidential contenders were George Wallace, Richard Nixon, and Hubert Humphrey. Okay, now Nixon's presidency. While in office, Nixon reached out in the Cold War and met with several key communist leaders. He met with Mao Zedong, the People's Republic of China. He met with Zhou Enlai, the People's Republic of China, and Leonid Brezhnev from the Soviet Union. He was elected to a second term in 1972. However, the Watergate scandal would cause him serious problems in his second term. And we'll talk a little bit about Watergate. During the 1972 election, a group of burglars broke into the Democrat offices at the Watergate Hotel. Okay, remember Nixon was a Republican. So burglars broke into his enemy's office, basically, or his opponent, I should say. They were connected to an organization called the Committee to Re-elect the President. So the men caught breaking into the Watergate offices were charged with conspiracy, wiretapping, and burglary. Watergate scandal was uncovered by two reporters named Bernstein and Woodward. So that's what goes here. After news of Watergate broke, Nixon eventually resigned. His vice president, Gerald Ford, took over. And Ford pardoned Nixon. Why did he do that? He did it to help America move on. Okay, let's see, where are we? Whoops, let's go back. Previous. Okay. Civil rights movement that was also happening at this time. The Emmett Till case was a case where a black man was murdered after he said, "Bye, baby," to a married white woman. Okay, so all he did was say, "Bye, baby," but the woman was white and she was married, and so he was murdered. Um, Many African Americans witnessed the beating and murder, but most were afraid to testify because they feared violence. Okay, they were afraid they would be murdered too. Mose Wright did testify against the white murders, but he had to be relocated due to threats on his life. So there was a man who did testify, but they had to move him. Okay. The magazine Jet published pictures of Emmett Till's body. There was a lot of that going on at this time too in the South, in Florida also. All right, civil rights movement. One of the most important civil rights developments was at Topeka, Kansas, Topeka, which is where Brown versus Board of Education ruled that public schools could not be segregated. Okay, so prior to Brown versus Board of Education, there was a ruling a long time before it called Plessy versus Ferguson. And Plessy versus Ferguson said that segregation was legal. Okay, but then 60 or some years later, Brown versus Board of Education comes in and says that it's not. Segregation is not allowed. Okay, so earlier civil rights leaders, Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, and A. Philip Randolph. In the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. used peaceful protests to try to get equal rights for blacks. Although he achieved a lot of success at getting African Americans more freedoms, Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. This led to many violent race riots across the country. Okay, and then a little bit about our culture. In the 1960s, we saw the emergence of a lot of rock bands, including the Beatles, Smokey Robinson, and Peter, Paul, and Mary. 1969, the musical festival Woodstock became a cultural icon of the baby boomers generation. And baby boomers are people born between the years 1946 and 1964. All right, and the last one. The Stonewall riots brought homosexuality to the public eye and changed many opinions and attitudes. Because of charges of bribery and tax evasion, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned. And the Six-Day War between Israel and its neighbors resulted in 300,000 displaced Palestinians, embarrassing losses for Arab leaders and their states, and the USA and USSR failed as arbitrators. If you have any questions, contact me by email or phone.